What is the craziest thing you have ever done for love? Not the kind of love that looks good in photographs or sounds nice in wedding speeches. The kind that keeps you up at night staring at the ceiling. The kind that makes you talk to empty chairs and save voicemails from 10 years ago because you cannot bear to delete the sound of a voice that no longer exists. The kind that makes a grown man cover 300 acres of grapevines in old newspapers while an entire town points and laughs and calls him a fool. This is the story of Silas Crane. And before you judge what he did, before you shake your head and scroll away, you need to understand why he did it. Because what this quiet farmer from Millbrook discovered did not just save his vineyard. It broke every rule of agriculture that the so-called experts had written in stone. It turned disaster into miracle. And it all started with a woman who loved crossword puzzles more than she loved breathing. Millbrook, California, 1987. If you have never been to wine country in late August, imagine standing inside a painting where the sky is too blue to be real, and the hills roll on forever like green and gold waves frozen in time. The air smells of warm earth and ripening fruit, and the light has this quality, this honey-colored thickness that makes everything look like a memory even while it is happening. The mornings are cool enough to need a jacket, but by noon the sun sits heavy on your shoulders, and the dust from the dirt roads rises in golden clouds behind every pickup truck. This was Silas Crane's world. For 42 years he had woken up before dawn, pulled on his worn denim jacket with the frayed cuffs, and walked the rows of his family's vineyard with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The Crane vineyard was not the biggest in the valley. It was not the fanciest. It did not have the modern tasting room or the imported stone walls that the newer estates boasted, but it was honest. The soil had been tilled by Silas's grandfather, then his father, then Silas himself. And for a man who believed that roots mattered more than reputation, that was enough. Silas had married Margaret Elaine Whitmore in the summer of 1965, under an oak tree that still stood at the northern edge of the property, its branches spread wide like the arms of a patient grandfather. Maggie. That was what everyone called her. But Silas only called her Margaret when he was being serious, and he only called her by her full name about 3 times in their entire marriage. Each time had been momentous. Once when he proposed, once when she told him she was sick, and once late at night when she was dying and he was begging her to stay. She was small and fierce and had a laugh that carried across the vineyard like a church bell on Sunday morning. While Silas tended the soil with his calloused hands, Margaret tended the stories. She read every newspaper she could find: the Millbrook Gazette, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, which Silas could not understand at all. She clipped recipes for pot roast and apple pie, circled typos with a red pen that she kept in her apron pocket, filled out every crossword puzzle in permanent black ink, and stacked the finished papers in towers around their small farmhouse until Silas joked that they were going to need a second house just for the news. Information is fertilizer for the mind, she would say, her glasses sliding down her nose, her finger tracing the words on the page like she was reading Braille. And Silas would smile because he did not read much beyond the weather report and the tractor manual, but he loved to watch her read. He loved the way her lips moved slightly when she encountered a word she did not know. He loved how she would read him headlines over dinner, turning the world's chaos into something they could hold between them like a shared secret. He loved how she would finish a crossword puzzle and set down her pen with a satisfied sigh, as if she had just solved one of the universe's great mysteries. They had no children. The doctors had said it was not possible, and Silas and Margaret had mourned for a month and then moved on. The vineyard became their child. The rows of Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay were their family. The old oak tree was their witness. And when the sun went down behind the western hills, painting the sky in colors that no newspaper could ever capture, no photograph could ever hold, Silas and Margaret would sit on their porch with a bottle of their own wine and watch the stars come out one by one, as if the universe itself was reading them a story that had no end. Then, in the spring of 1986, Margaret got sick. It happened slowly, and then all at once, the way these things always do. A cough that would not go away, that started in February and sounded like nothing more than the winter cold that everyone in the valley caught sooner or later. A tiredness that sleep could not fix, that made her set down her crossword puzzles by March because her hands shook too much to hold the pen steady. By the time the doctors at the county hospital said the word, it was already too late. Cancer. Pancreatic. The kind that moves through the body like a wildfire through dry grass, consuming everything before anyone even smells the smoke. Silas watched the woman who had been his compass, his anchor, his reason for waking up in the morning, shrink into something fragile and bird-like in their bed, surrounded by the newspapers she could no longer read, the crossword puzzles she could no longer finish. He held her hand through the nights when the morphine was not enough. He read to her from the newspapers she loved, stumbling over words he did not know, mispronouncing names of foreign cities and political figures, and she would squeeze his hand with what little strength she had left to tell him it was okay, that his voice was the only headline she needed. He brought her grapes from the vineyard, washed them in the kitchen sink, peeled them for her when her teeth grew too weak, and fed them to her one by one like communion wafers. She died on a Tuesday in October. The harvest was in. The leaves were turning the color of old copper. And Silas Crane became a man made of silence. He did not attend the funeral dinner at the church hall. He could not bear to hear people say she was in a better place, because the better place was right here, right in this kitchen, with flour on her apron and ink on her fingers and the smell of her lavender soap still in the bathroom. He let the newspapers pile up in every room of the farmhouse, towers of yellowing newsprint that reached toward the ceiling like monuments. Neighbors brought casseroles in glass dishes that he never returned. He left them on the porch until the raccoons got them, until the flies came, until the food turned to mold that matched the color of his grief. The vineyard, which had always been his joy, became a graveyard of memory. He walked the rows not to tend them, but because Margaret had walked them, and he was trying to find her footprints in the dirt, her shadow in the shade of the leaves. Winter came hard that year. The vines went dormant, bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Silas sat in the farmhouse surrounded by 40 years of newspapers, and he talked to Margaret as if she were still in the next room, still working on her crossword, still waiting for him to bring her coffee. "What do I do with all these papers, love?" he asked the empty chair at the kitchen table. "You spent your whole life collecting them. You said every story mattered. I can't just throw them out. That would be like throwing out pieces of you, and I don't have enough of you left to throw anything away." Spring arrived early in 1987, too early, almost cruel in its optimism. The valley warmed too fast. The buds broke early, tender and vulnerable, and Silas knew trouble was coming the way an old sailor knows a storm by the ache in his bones. A heat wave was forecast for late June, the kind of sustained, brutal temperatures that could cook grapes on the vine before they ever had a chance to become wine, before they ever knew what sweetness was. The other vineyard owners were not worried. They had irrigation systems that cost more than Silas's entire property. They had shade cloth imported from Europe. They had agricultural consultants with degrees from university Silas could not pronounce. They had modern solutions for modern problems. But Silas had something else. He had grief that would not leave him, and he had 3,000 pounds of old newspapers that he could not bear to burn. The idea came to him on a night in May when the wind was wrong and the moon was too bright, and the silence in the farmhouse was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat. He was sitting on the porch with a stack of the Millbrook Gazette from 1973, the year they had their best harvest. The year Margaret had been so happy that her laughter seemed to echo off the hills for months. She had circled the Harvest Festival announcement in red ink and drawn a little heart in the margin, and next to it she had written "Our Year." Silas ran his thumb over that heart, over those words, and something broke inside him, or maybe something finally healed. He walked out to row 17. The row Margaret had always called her favorite because it caught the morning light just right, because the grapes there seemed to ripen 3 days before everywhere else, because she said the vines in that row knew they were loved. He took a section of newspaper and wrapped it around the base of a vine, tucking it in like he was tucking a child into bed, like he had tucked Margaret in on the nights when she was cold and the blankets were not enough. Then another, and another. He worked through the night, not thinking about science or agriculture or what the neighbors would say, thinking only that if he covered the vines, maybe he could protect them the way Margaret had always protected him. Maybe he could keep something alive in a world that kept taking everything away. By morning, row 17 looked absurd. Strips of yellowed newsprint fluttered in the breeze, like prayer flags on a Himalayan mountain. Headlines from 1968, mixed with sports scores from 1974, and recipes for pot roast and wedding announcements from strangers long dead. Silas stood back and looked at his work, his hands black with ink, his knees stiff from kneeling in the dirt, and for the first time since Margaret died, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt purpose. He felt like he was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, even if he could not explain why. But the purpose looked like madness. And madness in a small town is never allowed to exist quietly. Tom Brennan, who owned the Vineyard to the east and had been Silas's friend since grade school, was the first to see it. He was driving his Ford truck along the dirt road that separated their properties when he slammed on the brakes so hard that his dog fell off the seat. He stared. He rubbed his eyes. He stared again. Then he laughed. A big, booming laugh that carried across the valley and bounced off the hills like a thunderclap. He drove to Silas's house and found him on the porch, drinking coffee that had gone cold and staring at the newspaper-wrapped vines with an expression that Tom could only describe as serene, as peaceful, as the face of a man who had finally found something to believe in. "Silas," Tom said, trying to catch his breath, his face red from laughing and from the morning sun. "What in God's name have you done to your vines?" "I covered them," Silas said simply, as if he were commenting on the weather. "I can see that, you old fool." "But why? Why would you wrap your vines in newspaper?" Silas looked at the newspapers fluttering in the breeze and then at Tom. Margaret loved these papers. She spent her whole life reading them, collecting them, believing they held the answers to everything. And the heat is coming. The buds broke early. I need to protect them. She would have wanted me to protect them. Protect them? Tom shook his head, his laughter fading into something that sounded almost like pity. "Silas, newspapers don't protect vines. They make you look like you've lost your mind. The whole valley is talking. My wife heard about it at the grocery store. My kids heard about it at school. You need to take that stuff down before someone from the county sees it. You'll be the laughingstock of Millbrook. You'll be the laughingstock of the entire state." Silas took a sip of his cold coffee and looked out at row 17. "Maybe I already am," he said, "but at least I'm laughing about something." Tom left, convinced his neighbor had gone insane from grief. And he was not wrong to think it. Grief had changed Silas. It had hollowed out parts of him that would never fill again. But it had not broken him. Not yet. Not where it mattered. Within a week, the story had spread through Millbrook like a virus, like wildfire, like every other piece of small-town gossip that feeds on the misfortune of others. The Millbrook Gazette, the same paper Margaret had read for 40 years, the same paper that had announced their engagement and her obituary, ran a small item on page 3 with a photograph that made Silas look like a mad prophet. Local farmer wraps vines in newsprint. Novel technique or cry for help. The article was gentle but condescending, written by a young reporter who had never planted anything in her life, suggesting that Silas Crane was dealing with his wife's death in a way that was unconventional and concerning to neighbors who care about his well-being. People drove by just to look. Carloads of teenagers on Friday nights would cruise past the Crane Vineyard, headlights sweeping across rows of newspaper-wrapped vines, hooting and hollering out open windows, throwing empty beer cans into the fields. Someone's spray-painted Crazy Silas in bright orange letters on the wooden sign at the entrance to his property. The local wine cooperative sent a delegation. 3 men in clean boots and polo shirts, who had never worked a harvest in their lives, who stood in Silas's kitchen and explained in patient, patronizing tones that his actions were bringing down property values and making the entire region look backward, look foolish, look like a place where madness was tolerated. "Mr. Crane," said the head of the cooperative, a man named Richard Holloway, who had never had dirt under his fingernails in his life, who bought his wine by the case from distributors and called himself a connoisseur. "We understand you've been through a difficult time. We all loved Margaret. She was a wonderful woman. But this newspaper business has to stop. It's unhygienic. It's unprofessional. It's attracting the wrong kind of attention. And frankly, it's embarrassing for all of us who are trying to maintain standards in this valley." Silas looked at the 3 men and then out the window at his vineyard, at the rows of newsprint fluttering in the afternoon breeze. "My wife read every one of those papers," he said quietly. "She believed that if you read enough, if you paid enough attention, you could solve any problem. She believed that every story held a lesson. I'm just taking her advice. I'm just reading the soil the way she read the news." The delegation left, shaking their heads, muttering about intervention and mental health services. Richard Holloway told anyone who would listen that Silas Crane was a danger to himself and to the reputation of Millbrook wine. The County Agricultural Extension Office sent a formal letter warning him about potential code violations and threatening fines. His own cousin, who lived in Sacramento and had not visited in 15 years, called to suggest he sell the vineyard and move into a retirement community where someone could keep an eye on him and make sure he doesn't hurt himself. But Silas did not stop. He could not stop. Because something was happening to row 17 that he could not explain. Something that felt like magic and science and Margaret's hand on his shoulder all at once. The vines under the newspapers were greener. The leaves were broader, darker, more alive. The tiny grape clusters, no bigger than peas when he started his strange project, were swelling with an intensity that the uncovered rows did not match, a vitality that seemed almost aggressive. It was not dramatic, it was subtle. But Silas noticed because he had spent 40 years noticing subtle things, because he knew his vineyard the way a father knows his child's face. The newspaper-wrapped vines held moisture longer in the morning, the dew collecting under the paper like secret rain. The paper reflected the harshest afternoon sunlight, creating a dappled shade that kept the leaves from scorching while still letting through enough light to feed the plant. And something else. Something Silas could not name but could feel in his bones. was happening in the soil beneath the paper. As the newspapers broke down, as the ink bled into the earth with each watering, the soil seemed darker, richer, more alive, as if the words themselves were becoming food. He started covering more rows, not all at once. He was 71 years old, and the work was backbreaking, humbling, endless. His knees ached, his back screamed, his fingers stained black with ink that would not wash off. But every morning, before the sun rose, he would take a stack of Margaret's newspapers and walk a new row. He used the weather reports from 1972 to wrap the Chardonnay, because they understood seasons. He used the crossword sections to cover the Cabernet, because they understood puzzles. The obituaries went around the Pinot Noir because, as Silas told Margaret's empty chair that night, they understand loss better than anyone. The sports pages went to the Zinfandel because they understand struggle and comeback. The wedding announcements covered the Merlot because they understand what it means to start something that lasts. By June, 200 of his 300 acres were wrapped in newsprint. The vineyard looked like a bizarre art installation, a collaboration between a madman and a librarian, between grief and hope. Pilots flying overhead reported it to air traffic control as a possible emergency, a strange white pattern in the green valley. A photographer from a San Francisco art magazine drove down and took pictures, calling it folk art and a profound commentary on the ephemeral nature of agriculture and memory. A local television station sent a crew who filmed Silas working and asked him questions he did not answer. Silas did not care what they called it. He did not care what they thought. He cared only that the vines were thriving, that Margaret's papers were doing something beautiful, that he had found a way to keep her close. Then the heat wave came. The National Weather Service had predicted a warm summer, but no one predicted what actually arrived, what descended on the valley like the wrath of an angry god. Day after day, temperatures climbed past 105, 110, 115. The sky turned white and merciless, a blank page that offered no answers. The hills baked until the grass crunched underfoot like broken glass. The soil cracked into deep fissures that looked like wounds. Irrigation systems that had been adequate for decades strained and failed under the demand, pumps burning out, wells running dry. The valley became an oven, a kiln, a place where nothing green should survive. Vineyard owners watched in horror as their crops withered before their eyes. Leaves turned brown and crisp overnight, curling like burned paper. Grapes, which had been promising just weeks before, shriveled into hard little raisins on the stem, their sweetness turning to dust. The wine cooperative held emergency meetings in air-conditioned offices where men who had mocked Silas now prayed for solutions they did not have. The county declared an agricultural disaster. Tom Brennan lost 60% of his crop in 2 weeks, standing in his fields with tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. Richard Holloway's fancy new drip irrigation system, the one he had bragged about at every cooperative meeting, saved only half of his grapes. Across Millbrook, farmers stood in their dying fields and wept, not just for the money they were losing, but for the land that had betrayed them, for the future that was burning up before their eyes. But at the Crane Vineyard, something impossible was happening, something that would later be written about in agricultural journals and whispered about in wine bars. From Napa to Bordeaux, the newspapers had created a microclimate that no scientist had predicted and no farmer had imagined. The layers of newsprint, soaked by the morning irrigation and dried by the sun, formed a barrier that trapped moisture in the soil while reflecting the brutal heat upward, away from the tender vines. The vines beneath the papers did not scorch. The leaves stayed green and supple, drinking in the light that filtered through the paper in soft golden bands. The grape clusters, protected by the ink-stained canopy, continued to swell, continued to dream of wine. And as the heat intensified, as the valley around them turned to dust, something miraculous happened to the grapes themselves. The stress of the heat, combined with the unique moisture retention of the newspaper mulch, triggered a response in the vines that no one had ever seen before. The grapes began to turn color early, not just the purple of Cabernet or the green of Chardonnay. They turned gold, a deep, luminous, impossible gold that seemed to glow from within, as if each grape held a tiny sun. Silas noticed it first on row 17, the row where it had all begun, the row where Margaret's favorite vine still stood. He pulled back a strip of the Millbrook Gazette from 1973, the paper with the little red heart, and found a cluster of grapes the color of late afternoon sunlight, the color of Margaret's hair in September. He cut one open with his pocket knife and tasted it, and he fell to his knees in the dirt, his body shaking with sobs that had been waiting for months to escape. The flavor was unlike anything he had ever grown. It was honey and stone fruit and vanilla and something else, something that tasted like memory, like Margaret's laughter on the porch, like 40 years of mornings when the world was still new and full of promise. He did not tell anyone. He was not sure he believed it himself. But as July turned to August and the heat wave continued its merciless assault on the valley, the golden grapes spread, not to every vine, but to enough. The newspaper-wrapped rows were producing fruit that should not exist, that could not exist according to every textbook and every expert. Grapes that were sweeter than science said was possible. Grapes with a sugar content so high that the refractometer Silas used to measure Brix levels showed numbers that made him check the device 3 times. That made him wonder if Margaret was somehow reaching through the soil and touching the fruit herself. The town was too busy with its own disaster to notice. Funeral processions of pickup trucks carried dead vines to burning piles that sent black smoke into the white sky. The wine cooperative declared the worst harvest in 50 years, maybe in a century. Banks started calling in loans that farmers could not pay. Families that had farmed the valley for generations put up for sale signs and drove away with their trailers packed, their dreams abandoned, their roots cut. Millbrook became a town of widows and widowers, of empty barns and silent fermentation tanks, of men who sat on their porches at night and stared at fields that would never recover. Silas worked alone through it all. He replaced newspapers that had disintegrated in the heat. He watered his protected rows with a devotion that looked, to anyone watching, like religious ritual, like prayer made visible. And every evening, as the sun went down and the valley cooled, he sat with a golden grape in his hand and talked to Margaret. "You knew," he whispered to the wind, to the soil, to the ghost that walked beside him. "You knew all along that the answers were in those papers. You were preparing me. You were preparing the soil. You were writing me a story that I was too stubborn to read until now." August ended. September brought cooler nights but no rain, the sky still clear and cruel. The harvest season arrived, and with it came the reckoning that Millbrook had been dreading, and Silas had been waiting for without knowing it. Richard Holloway organized the annual Harvest Festival out of habit. Though everyone knew there was nothing to celebrate, nothing to toast, nothing to hope for. It was a somber affair, held in the parking lot of the cooperative warehouse, under a banner that read Millbrook Harvest Festival in letters that seemed to mock the emptiness of the words. Farmers traded stories of loss, like war veterans, trading stories of battles they wished they could forget. The local news sent a reporter to document the disaster, to capture the faces of men who had lost everything. And then, on the morning of the festival, when the fog was still burning off the valley floor and the air smelled of smoke and defeat, Silas Crane drove his old pickup truck to the center of town and opened the tailgate. He had brought grapes, not the sad, sun-scorched remnants that everyone else had managed to salvage from their ruined fields. Not the small, hard fruit that passed for grapes that year. He had brought grapes that looked like they had been dipped in liquid gold, like treasure from a king's vault, like something that belonged in a painting rather than on a farm. He set up a simple wooden table, placed a cluster of his golden grapes on it, and stood back. He did not say anything. He did not have to. The grapes spoke for themselves. Tom Brennan was the first to approach. He had lost most of his crop and most of his hope. He had not shaved in a week. He walked up to the table, looked at the grapes with eyes that had forgotten how to see beauty, and then looked at Silas. "What are these?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Try one," Silas said. Tom picked up a grape, small and perfect and glowing, and put it in his mouth. His eyes widened. He chewed slowly, carefully, as if he were tasting something sacred. And then he sat down hard on the edge of the truck bed, his legs no longer able to hold him. "Silas," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "What did you do? What in God's name did you do?" People gathered. Word spread through the festival like the heat had spread through the valley, like fire, like revelation. Soon, the table was surrounded by farmers, reporters, and wine critics who had driven down from San Francisco to document the disaster and found themselves witnessing a miracle instead. They tasted the grapes. They argued about them. They wept over them. A food scientist from UC Davis took samples and ran tests on the spot, his portable equipment showing sugar levels and acidity balances that were theoretically impossible given the conditions, numbers that made him remove his glasses and clean them twice, as if the problem was his eyes and not the fruit. Richard Holloway pushed through the crowd, his face pale, his hands shaking. He looked at the grapes. He looked at Silas. And for the first time since they had met, he did not look condescending. He did not look superior. He looked afraid. He looked small. "How?" Holloway asked, his voice cracking. "How is this possible?" Silas looked out at the crowd, at the faces that had laughed at him, pitied him, called him crazy, sent him letters threatening fines, told him to move to a retirement home. He thought about Margaret. He thought about 40 years of mornings with coffee and crossword puzzles and the sound of her pen on paper. He thought about wrapping vines in newspaper, not because he knew it would work, but because he could not bear to throw away the last things his wife had touched, the last evidence that she had been here, that she had mattered, that her stories were worth saving. "I covered my vines in old newspapers," Silas said. His voice was quiet, but in the silence of the crowd, in the stillness of a town that had forgotten how to hope it carried, it rang like a bell. "My wife, Margaret, collected newspapers her whole life. She believed that every story mattered, that every word had weight, that if you paid attention, if you really listened, the world would tell you its secrets. When she died, I couldn't throw them away. I couldn't burn them. I couldn't let them become nothing. So I put them in the soil. I put them around the vines. And I think she was protecting us one last time. I think she was teaching me that love doesn't end just because someone is gone. It just finds new ways to grow." The crowd was silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Tom Brennan started to clap, slowly at first, his hands coming together in a rhythm that sounded like rain on a dry roof, and then faster. And then everyone was clapping, some with tears running down their sunburned faces, some with their hats pressed to their chests, some with their children lifted on their shoulders so they could see the man who had covered his vineyard in love and produced a miracle. The person, not because they understood the science, but because they understood the love. Because in a season of death, Silas Crane had found a way to make something live. The science, when it came, was almost as beautiful as the story. The UC Davis team spent 3 weeks at the Crane Vineyard, taking soil samples and grape samples and newspaper samples, shaking their heads in disbelief. They discovered that the combination of aged newsprint, soy-based ink from the 960 and 70s and the specific mineral composition of Millbrook soil had created a perfect storm of agricultural luck that no laboratory could have designed. The newspapers acted as a moisture-retaining mulch that was superior to straw or wood chips because the dense paper compacted just enough to prevent evaporation without suffocating the soil, creating a reservoir of water that sustained the vines through the drought. The ink, which in those days contained high levels of carbon and trace minerals from the printing process, enriched the soil as it broke down, feeding microorganisms that made the roots stronger, deeper, more resilient. And the reflective white and gray surfaces of the newsprint created an albedo effect, bouncing the worst of the heat away from the vines while maintaining a stable temperature at the root level, protecting the fruit from the thermal shock that had destroyed every other vineyard in the valley. But that was not the whole story. The real secret was in the grapes themselves. The stress of the heat wave, combined with the unique protection of the newspapers, had forced the vines to produce anthocyanins and other phenolic compounds at extraordinary levels, a survival response that no one had ever documented before. The grapes had turned gold not as a fluke, not as a trick of the light, but as a survival mechanism, the vine's way of saying thank you, of giving everything it had to the fruit because it knew it was loved. And that survival mechanism had created a flavor profile that wine critics would later describe as transcendent, as a wine that tastes like forgiveness, as liquid sunlight. The first vintage of Crane Vineyard Golden Reserve sold at auction for $4,000 a bottle, and buyers from Tokyo to London fought for the privilege of owning a case. Silas, who had never cared about money, who had never wanted more than enough to keep the land and the memory alive, donated most of the proceeds to a literacy program in Margaret's name, a program that still teaches children to read in the Millbrook Public Library. The town of Millbrook changed after that harvest. Not immediately. Old prejudices do not dissolve like sugar in water. They soften, they fade, they become something else. The crazy Silas sign at the entrance to his property was taken down by anonymous hands in the night, replaced by a new sign that read Crane Vineyard, East, 1945, in letters that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Richard Holloway resigned from the cooperative and took a job selling real estate in Santa Rosa, never mentioning Silas Crane again, never quite able to look himself in the mirror. Tom Brennan started covering his own vines in newspaper the following spring, though he used fresh newsprint and got only modest results. He told everyone who would listen that it was not about the paper. It was about the love. It was about believing